good evening. Here's hoping that you're all very, very well. Welcome to the first Celtic Source live session of this season, this autumn and winter season. I haven't been doing these over the summer because I've had plenty of other things to do, but I'm back now. And in this session, we're going to be looking at a very interesting aspect of the Welsh mythology concerning Arthur. The actual title of this talk is probably something like Arthur and the Transcendence of Death or something like that, but I didn't necessarily want to include death in the very first title. The next 3, maybe 4 weeks are going to be spent looking at Arthurian material, Welsh Arthurian material, really to fill out sections of the Four Branches course and sections of the Taliesin tradition course. I just spent 6 months teaching several of these courses back to back, and I did notice a few gaps, and then I've had some requests also from folks to cover some Arthurian material. In this session, we're going to be looking at one particular source text, and it's a source text that informs our understanding of the fourth branch of the Mabinogi in particular. Now, for those of you who sat the Four Branches course, you will know that it's a very involved branch. There are lots of animal transformations and lots of quite ancient themes contained in the story. We can excavate these deeper layers of mythology with a little bit of guesswork and interpretation. We're going to expand on that work a little bit here. I have mentioned this source text on the course, but not in detail. I did discuss it 3 or 4 years back online, but I don't think that video's up anymore, so this will do as a replacement. The text that we're going to be looking at is called The Dialogue of Arthur and the Eagle. Ymddiddan Arthur ar Eryr. And as far as we can tell, this is a 12th century poem. It's actually recorded in what appears to be a 14th century manuscript, but clever folks like Sir Ifor Williams have noticed that the spelling of certain words really belong in the 12th century or perhaps the 13th. The 12th century is probably the earliest we can go back. When we're looking at these types of texts, we are, of course, looking at what was almost certainly a piece of poetry that would have been orally performed, but was then frozen in manuscript. And then that manuscript, in turn, influences the oral tradition and vice versa. It's a very interesting text because it was obviously popular for a very, very long period of time. Nerys Jones, who wrote fabulous book a couple of years back, Arthur in Early Welsh Poetry, has this to say: of all the poems examined in this volume, in her book, this one, The Dialogue of Arthur and the Eagle, has the most complicated textual history, testifying to its use over many generations as a work to be both performed and read. Now, what Nerys and Jones means by that is that there are many different variations of this poem found throughout the manuscript tradition of Wales. So far, I think they found about 30 different variations from manuscripts as early as the 15th all the way through to as late as the 18th century. So for that whole period of time, this poem was considered important enough to be copied several times and adapted to the language of those times, but also memorized and performed. It was clearly a piece of poetry that many people enjoyed hearing. It clearly sparked people's imagination. It caught their attention, and people returned to it time and time again, generation after generation. Now, of course, every now and again, poems like this would go to sleep for a few generations, but because they're copied down, they would come alive again. People would read them and become intrigued by them and memorize them and perform them again. So in that way, the oral tradition and the written tradition, they feed each other. It's not so much one excluding the other necessarily, but both really making up two sides of the same tradition, the same cultural movement. On the surface of it, this poem is a poem of Christian instruction. But as we'll see, it also contains many non-Christian pagan elements. Not so much on the surface, but really in the structure of the poem, in the situation that the poem describes. The basic situation is there is a character called Arthur, who is the King Arthur that we know and love, although this could be King Arthur earlier in his career, because he's not mentioned as the great be-all and end-all King of Kings. He is described as a battle leader, as a general, as a warrior, as someone who is brave in battle. The poem is also situated in Cornwall. So this could testify to a tradition regarding Arthur's earlier career before he became renowned over Europe and took over the world. Now, in the poem, in the dialogue, what we have essentially is Arthur asking questions of an eagle, and the eagle responds to him, and the eagle turns out to be his nephew, his dead nephew, Eliwlad. And Eliwlad appears to have materialized or incarnated in the form of an eagle before Arthur to teach him about Christianity, essentially. Now, Arthur, in this poem, he is a little bit dim, bless him. He's not necessarily the Arthur of Geoffrey of Monmouth in the later European tradition. He appears to be the Arthur of Welsh folk culture of perhaps 800, 900, perhaps 1,000 years ago. In Wales, this was probably quite a late period in the development of the Arthurian myth. So Arthur could well have blossomed as a great symbolic figure during the first millennia, sometime after the Romans have left. And by the time we get to the second millennia, of about 1,000 years ago, his status hasn't necessarily diminished, but he's certainly become a very diverse folk character. He's not just praised and set on a pedestal, he's also a feature of folk culture and of folk learning. And he takes on different roles as a folk character. One of them being the straight man, if you like, to saints. He is really the idiotic or arrogant nobleman who needs to be taught. He's featured in quite a few saints' lives of this period. This is how Brynleu F. Roberts describes him, I think specifically in the life of Saint Cadog. For the most part, Arthur is a foil for the saint, an arrogant, grasping tyrant who is humbled in ignominious defeat, not in any armed struggle, but in his childish greed and even in his failure to fulfill his traditional role as giant or dragon slayer. Now, of course, those of you familiar with saints' lives, especially saints' lives in Wales and elsewhere in Britain, you'll know that the saint is often pitted against a pagan aristocrat, or at least a pagan aristocrat who needs to learn something. In this poem, this is Arthur. Arthur is in many ways a pagan who is looking for Christian learning. This is how Patrick Sims-Williams describes it. In the dialogue of Arthur and the Eagle, Arthur represents a typical member of the secular aristocracy, as in the Welsh saints' lives, and is the vehicle for some basic Christian instruction. Arthur is a religiously uneducated but sympathetic pagan seeking enlightenment. So clearly we are in a Christian genre which sets the church above the aristocracy to a degree, or at least portrays the clergy as absolutely essential to aristocratic life. Not that dissimilar to the bards, of course. The Welsh bards positioned themselves as indispensable to their patrons, and here we can see the church taking up a similar approach, positioning themselves as priests, as teachers, as protectors of the spiritual purity of these noblemen. It's a very useful form of propaganda in many ways. Now, it's also not that peculiar to find this type of poem making use of a bird to explore and to express Christian learning. Now, there are several dialogue poems in the Christian tradition. Some of them are very similar in content to this, but some specifically do use birds. We can think of the Englynion y Clywyd, which are a series of stanzas, not that dissimilar to what we're going to look at in this session. And in these stanzas, we have different saints, different characters from Welsh myth, but also birds, larks, ravens, relating parables and wisdom. Diarhebion, as we would say in Wales. So it's not peculiar to find a bird being used in this Christian context either. We can also think of the great Dafydd ap Gwilym, who very famously composed a few poems where it's the birds who perform the Christian Mass in the forest, in the woodland. This is the Christian ceremony set in nature. So it's not peculiar to find what we might consider to be more rustic elements or more non-Christian elements featured in this type of poetry. In many ways, this is the church trying to speak to common folk in their own symbolic language. It's trying to make Christian learning, Christian belief and Christian dogma accessible to people who might not be that familiar with its styles, with its philosophy. Now, Christians of this time clearly had no problem seeing birds as divine messengers with very special knowledge to teach. But I don't think this is a uniquely Christian quality of this text. I think that we can also look at the very supernatural role that birds play in the four branches of the Mabinogi, for example. Those of you who've sat the course will be quite familiar with those different episodes where we have birds playing very profound symbolic roles in the stories. So this isn't uniquely Christian. It's not uniquely non-Christian or pagan. It's something that's quite common. Let's take a look at this poem anyway. As you can see, it's in stanzas. These are known as Englynion Milwr. It's a very traditional and very ancient form of poetry in Wales. 3-line stanzas, usually all on the same rhyme, usually all composed to the same syllable count. So there's a similar set of syllables in each line. It's not absolutely strict. This text, for example, is sometimes a little bit below and sometimes a little bit over the syllable count. Es rhyfedaf, that S at the very beginning, of course, is the same as the is. Is rhyfedaf canwyf bardd o flaen dar a'i brig yn hardd. Pi edrych erir pwy chwardd. I wonder at it, since I am a poet, standing before an oak tree whose top is beautiful. Why does the eagle stare? Why does it laugh? Very interesting opening stanza, because Arthur is, of course, describing himself as a poet. Elsewhere in medieval Welsh literature, we find Arthur composing stanzas similar to this. In Culhwch and Olwen, for example, he makes up a short stanza on the spot to make fun of one of his warriors. There are other hints and clues as to Arthur's fondness of composing poetry, but here, Arthur being a poet appears to be related to him being in wonder of this bird, or perhaps it's his poetic sensibility which gives him a clue as to the quality and the nature of this bird, because of course this is a supernatural eagle. It's about to start speaking to him. Arthur bellglod o'r ddiwes, ar llu llewenydd achles, yr erir gynt a thweled. O Arthur, one who gains far-flung fame, bear of a host, protector of merriment, the eagle saw you previously. That second line there, of course, is a play on Arthur's own name. The first part of Arthur, Arth, actually means bear. And this is an animal that's going to be referred to several times in the poem. So this is the eagle now speaking to the great Brenin Arthur, the great King Arthur. Ysryfedda fo ti mir, asgofynaf yn fyfyr, pi chwardd, pi edrych eryr. I wonder at it beside the sea. So the poem is set somewhere beside the sea in Cornwall. I ask it thoughtfully, why does the eagle laugh? Why does it stare? Why does this eagle stare at me, and why is it cackling or chuckling to itself? Arthur bellglod ynghynt, ar llu llawenydd dremynt eryr a thwelas gynt. O Arthur, one whose course brings far-flung fame, one whose destiny or whose journey through the world, that is, bear of a host of merry appearance. The eagle saw you previously, that is, this eagle, me the eagle, I've seen you before. Yr eryr a saif yn brig dar, O eagle who stands at the top of the oak tree. If you were descended from a species or lineage of birds, you would not be tame or gentle. If you really were an eagle, you wouldn't be this tame or gentle. You wouldn't be speaking to me. Arthur gleddfawd ar Uther, ni saved a alon racked ar Uther. O Arthur of the ferocious sword stroke, your enemies do not withstand your attack. I am the son of Madog, son of Uther. Of course, Uther here is what English folks would know as Uther Pendragon, Arthur's father. This makes this eagle his nephew. This is Arthur's uncle's son. O eagle, I do not know your species lineage. Essentially saying, I'm not sure I understand who you are. Who frequents the valley wood of Cornwall? The son of Madog, son of Uther, is not alive. If you are who you claim to be, well, you're dead. Arthur ieith gyferdelit, Arth gwir nid gwared lyd, Eliwlad gynt ymgelwyd. O Arthur, one whose language is splendid, bear of warriors. It's quite difficult to translate the next line there, but it probably means something like, there's no deliverance from your wrath. There's probably a syllable missing between gwared and lead. It probably reads something like, nid gwared orth lead. That would cause the mutation in lead. So there's no deliverance from your wrath. Bear of warriors, there's no deliverance from your wrath. Eliwlad was I called previously. So now this eagle claims to be the actual incarnation of Arthur's nephew Eliwlad. To which Arthur responds, O eagle of faultless vision, with your power of speech there is no fault. Can you be Eliwlad, my nephew? To which the eagle responds, O Arthur, courageous in battle, leaving a swathe of fallen enemies, it is excellent to claim kinship by you. Now I reckon some of you have probably already guessed which episode in the fourth branch I'm referring to here. It's very similar to the episode in the fourth branch where Lleu has been killed and Gwydion goes to retrieve him from the tree. When we're considering the underlying structure of this poem, we find it very, very similar to what goes on in the fourth branch. And for those of you who are familiar with my style of work, you'll know that I'm always looking for comparisons between different texts, be they comparisons with other Welsh texts or sometimes Irish or Scottish or maybe even texts from continental Europe, but some similarity to point to a common belief, something which could tell us something about the mythology of the period. Now, not necessarily mythology in the highfalutin religious sense, but mythology as in, what did people generally believe to be commonly understood values, commonly understood symbols, commonly understood narratives that held some ancestral power for people, that were important to them in the type of oral culture that we're so often studying in these sessions and on these courses. To draw out the similarities, let's just pay some specific attention to this episode from the fourth branch. This is the moment when Lleu is killed. Then Gronw, who is Blodeued's lover, got up from the hill called Bryn Cyfergyr, and on one knee he aimed at Lleu with the poisoned spear, and struck him in his side so that the shaft stuck out of him, but the head remained inside. And then Lleu flew up in the form of an eagle, and gave a horrible scream, and he was not seen again. Of course, he was not seen again as a wounded man, until Gwydion comes across him. Gwydion, of course, follows a pig across the Welsh landscape until he comes to a special tree. The pig is eating the rotten flesh that's gathering below the tree. When Gwydion looks up to the top of the tree, he can see an eagle at the top of the tree. And when the eagle shakes himself, the worms and the rotten flesh fall from him, and the sow eats them. He thinks that the eagle is Lleu and sings an englyn, a type of short stanza. An oak grows between two lakes. Very dark is the sky in the valley. Unless I am mistaken, this is because of Lleu's flowers, which is, of course, quite a cryptic reference to Blodeuedd. Blodeuedd meaning woman of flowers, or the flower one. Yeah. Now, these are the basic similarities here. In both the poem and the fourth branch, a bard sees an eagle perched at the top of an oak. Stanzas, short verses, are used to communicate with this eagle. The eagle is the transmigrated soul of a dead nobleman, and in both cases the nobleman is a close relation to the bard, to Gwydion and Arthur. So there's a remarkable degree of similarity between both of these texts. Even though the dialogue of Arthur and the Eagle is explicitly a Christian text, later on in the poem there are plenty of other stanzas where Arthur asks things like, how should we best approach Christ, and what will happen on the day of judgment? He asks these very simplistic questions, which gives the eagle an opportunity to relate some Christian learning, to give some Christian teaching. But regardless of this heavily Christian content, we can see the underlying structure is actually something which is drawn from Welsh mythology. It's something which appears in the great classic of Welsh myth, the four branches of the Mabinogi. As I mentioned earlier, I don't think it's strange to think of the church and the learned men of the church looking at native Welsh culture and thinking to themselves, how can we best present our own dogma, our own learning, our own teaching? How can we best communicate Christianity to rural people, to peasants essentially, who may not be literate, who may not have that much experience of actual Christian dogma, because of course it was only really communicated in Latin. So it was a very elitist ceremony in many ways for many, many centuries. When we have a peasantry who are only really exposed to Christianity from outside of their social class, it's only the upper classes really who can communicate Christianity to them. Those upper class Christians, or those higher class Christians, not necessarily aristocrats or elites, but certainly not bonded labourers or slaves, these Christians would have gone out of their way to try and speak to these peasants in their own symbolic language, in their own terms. And I think this is an example of that. We find plenty of other examples in the lives of the saints also. Plenty of folk motifs, story structures which are very similar to folk tales, scattered throughout the saints' lives of Britain.